Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone, for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I kind of wanted to go through how the mentality of women had back in the ancient times. And I'm not really the type of person to talk about like women a lot all the time, but there was just a series of recent events um, that occurred within America in regards to this woman that basically deleted her three children, right? And basically, that kind of mindset, is being celebrated. It's being, what's the word I'm looking for? It's being pushed. It's being that kind of mindset is not condemned, but for us, through our apostles and elders, coming back and getting the understanding in regards to who we are and our culture and so on and so forth. If a man wants to have more than one wife, and that way, each woman is able to have their own children, that is a problem. That is seen as, messy. That is seen as, oh, you're a deadbeat. Oh, you're, you know what I'm saying? That's seen as a problem. And here it is. We live in a culture where, as a matter of fact, because Esau is guilty of this, because basically, let me just get two quick precepts, and I want to get two different accounts here. So this is Isaiah 5 verse 20, and it says, woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. So now we're living in a culture where what is deemed as evil according to the scriptures is seen as something that's good. Passing your seed through the fire from Molech, those different odious works that you read about in Wisdom of Solomon 12. You know what I'm saying? That kind of mindset, those Canaanite practices with those Hamite nations they were doing, those are the things that are being pushed within this society, right? It's not, having a man having multiple wives with all their children, that is seen as a problem. As a matter of fact, that was the next thing I wanted to grab. Let me just grab this real quick. This is Proverbs chapter 17, verse 15, and it says, he that justifieth the wicked, and he that condemneth the just, even they both are an abomination to the Lord, right? So now we're living in a culture where the things that are seen as problematic, they're praised for. They have terms for it. They call it is basically like negative reinforcement. So now the culture conditions the people and rewards something that is inherently evil, right? But it's being rewarded, right? So now, the woman, I think she got like money or something like that. you know she got like lots of money. That is something that is being celebrated for. Here it is. And that's the gross darkness of this culture. Because here it is, they're struggling to find husbands, they're struggling to maintain population control. And here it is, those kinds of practices are being implemented, and they're being rewarded. So not just implemented, they're being rewarded as well, right? This is why this society has to, be completely annihilated, because it perpetuates something that is inherently evil, and it rewards it as if it is good. But this is not good. The Lord's ways are truly higher than our ways, and not our thoughts his thoughts, to roughly paraphrase. So what I wanted to do, I want to go back into a little bit of history in regards to like how women saw their children, back in the ancient times, right? I just wanted to pick out a couple of examples, because, although, the men, we have fallen and, fallen into like idol worship, the Israelite men and stuff like that. Our women have essentially there been bamboozled, right? As the scriptures say, through her is the beginning of sin, and through her we all die, to roughly paraphrase, right? Because she was seduced, going back to Eve in the garden. So let me start off with Genesis, right? Just to show you the complete culture shock of how things were, because in this time, women actually don't, a lot of women don't actually care about having children like that. Ultimately, a lot of it, the times, is it's economics. You know what I'm saying? But a lot of them, even when they do have their children, there is a certain level of regret, like they regret motherhood, because that is seen as a burden, that is seen as a, they want to, this is what this society perpetuates. It perpetuates liberty without responsibility, right? So let me get this account within Genesis, going into the sons of Jacob, right? This is Genesis chapter 30. I'm going to read a little bit of this here. Verse 1 here, and this goes into Jacob's wives, right, and the birth of the 12 sons, right, which would eventually become the 12 tribes. And it says here, and when Rachel saw, let me go back, hold on. Okay, I'll just start at 30. And it says, and when Rachel saw that she bare no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the Most High stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of thy womb? And she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her. So eventually, to sleep with her. And she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her, right? So, Leah, she had the first, I guess, the first group of sons, right? I believe it was Reuben. Reuben was the firstborn, and I forgot who was the second. And then believe you had Simeon, Levi, right? But the point is, Rachel's mindset, she had a mindset of like, yo, give me, like, she was asking Jacob, like, yo, give me children, even though the Lord shut up her womb, right? And then Leah was the one that was doling out the children, doling out the sons for for a bit. The point is that Rachel, she wanted Jacob to give her sons, because remember, the son is the ones that carry the seed. The son is the one that has both the X and the Y chromosome, right? The son is the one that's able to continue the family line, because when you watch shows, like, for example, one of my favorite shows is Game of Thrones. you know it was always about the bloodline, and the bloodline, it continues, through the man, right? That's why they always wanted sons, because the sons are able to continue the family line, right? Regardless of the Israelite man laying with either an Israelite woman or a heathen woman, that child that's going to come out from that union is still going to be an Israelite, right? It just depends on the seed of the father, right? That's how we trace lineage, right? That is the ancient way of tracing lineage, right? So, this is verse 4, and then she said, and she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. And Jacob went in unto her, and Bilhah conceived and bare a son. And Rachel said, the Most High hath judged me, and he hath heard my voice, and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with my wrestlings, I have wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali, right? So it's basically just going into the sons of the different tribes, what we know as the tribes of Israel today. Jacob's name was eventually changed. But the point really is, that I really just wanted to hit was the fact that women wanted to have children, right? It wasn't seen, as a thing to actually not have children. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't seen as a burden. It wasn't seen as a responsibility, even though it is a responsibility. But in this time, it is seen as like a curse to have children. It's seen as a burden because women have that liberty to basically, as the scriptures say, gad abroad, right? You know, they want to have that liberty, they want to have liberty without responsibility, right? And proper culture promotes responsibility. It doesn't, Babylon the Great, aka also known as America, it pushes these different philosophies, that it doesn't promote family, right? It doesn't promote men and women, coming together. That's why a lot of these nations do not like the whore. As a matter of fact, let me go there and then I'll come back and I'll get another account. This is Jeremiah 51 verse 7, and it says, Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand that made the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. How for her? Take balm for her pain, if so she may be healed, right? So that wine represents those different mind states, philosophies, that have been pushed, and there's nations, even just the ways of life. This is why a lot of nations in the East, even like some like West African nations too, some nations in the Caribbean, and other nations in the West, they don't want that vibration being pushed on their children because they realize how detrimental that is. They realize how detrimental it is to have their women basically flaunting their stuff, going everywhere, the disregard for children, because the women are the basically, the proper caregivers to be able to nurture those children. So there needs to be a responsibility over their bodies. There needs to be a care over their bodies. There needs to be a mind frame of, you eat properly so you'll be able to nurture the children properly in the physical as well as the spiritual sense, right? But that is the problem with this society, right? And it's very anti-family. It's very anti coming together, right? A man and a woman basically in agreement, right? So I wanted to get another example of a woman that wanted, children, like to show you how far a lot of our women's minds have gone, right? So just bear with me. Let me look for this. Okay, this is 1 Samuel chapter 1. I'll start at verse 8 and I'll read down. And it says, then said Elkanah her husband, Hannah, why weepest thou? Why eatest thou not? Why is thy heart grieved? Am not I better than 10 sons? And Hannah rose up after she had eaten in Shiloh, after they had drunk, and now Eli the priest sat upon a seat by a post of the temple of the Lord. she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed to the Lord Yahweh Bashmil Shai, and wept sore. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord Yahweh Bashmil Shai of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look upon the affliction of thine handmaid, remember me, and forget not thine handmaid, but will give thine handmaid a man child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor come upon his head. And it came to pass, as she continued to pray before the Lord, that Eli marked her mouth. Now Hannah spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. And Eli said unto her, How long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee. And Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I am drunk. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Count not thine handmaid of the daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief and I spoken hitherto. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, the power Yahweh Bashmel Shai of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked him. And she said, Let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. So the woman went her way, did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. Right. So basically, this is Hannah. Hannah is the mother of Samuel, right? So, and Elkanah is Samuel's father, right? So Elkanah here, he had two wives, right? So he had another wife named Penina, and Penina was the one that had children, but Hannah had no children, right? So she had she had a very, very sorrowful spirit, you know, seeing, seeing the other wife, she had children, and when you see that, and like picture it in ancient times, like when a woman seeing that, she's like, because that's a joy to a woman, right, to be able to actually have children. Even to this day, as far as bugged out of a lot of our women are, a lot of, like, I work with this one woman, that's one thing she always talks about is basically, her sons, right? you know and you don't really see a lot of women of our nation that actually, they brag and talk about, their children, especially their sons. A lot of our women like to delete their sons, especially in the womb, right? They don't actually have a care about actually having children, right? They don't actually have a care and think about the importance of having sons. That nation like mindset is not there within our people. They don't have that nation building type of mentality to actually continue the family line and the family legacy, right? Let me read a little bit more of this real quick. And it says, And they rose up in the morning early and worshiped before the Lord, and returned and came to the house of Ramah. And Hannah knew his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And it came to pass, when the time was come about after Hannah had conceived, she bare a son, and she called his name Samuel, saying, Because I asked him of the Lord. Right? So she made her petition to the Lord Yahweh Bashimashai, and the Lord you know granted her a son. And that's how we hear about the story of basically Samuel, right? This is the beginnings of Samuel's birth, right? So you know I wanted to read this, just to show an illustration of how women's mindsets were seen back in the ancient times versus how a lot of these women, they're seen now, right? Their mindset is not to actually care about their children, right? This is why a lot of these women have to they have to go. In Ezekiel it says, slay utterly old and young, maids and little children. So like a lot of young women, they have that mindset, right? But don't come near the man that has the mark, to roughly paraphrase. And that mark is Thawa in Ezekiel 9, which basically means a mark of exemption, mercy, right? Because a lot of these women are not, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not free from judgment, right? So I just wanted to, talk about that, just to show you how far from the ancient times things were, and how much of a society needs to be, how much the kingdom of heaven needs to actually be properly established. You know what I'm saying? So, anyways, Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem El Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.